My name is Andrew Strachey, and I am a senior in Georgetown College studying government. I'm also a founding member of GU Votes, a student-led initiative run through GU Politics that's working to enhance Georgetown's voting culture through voter registration and absentee ballot request support across the student body. I am so excited to welcome Mayor Pete to Gaston Hall this morning. Mayor Buttigieg is the chief executive of the city of South Bend, Indiana. The city's 32nd mayor, he was sworn into office in 2012. As mayor, Pete is responsible for the city workforce of over 1,000 employees and an annual budget of more than $380 million. He previously served as president of the Indiana Urban Mayors Caucus and the Northern Indiana Mayors Roundtable, and serves on the boards of the Truman National Security Project and the United States Conference of Mayors. Please join me in giving a big welcome to Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Wow. All right.
I suddenly feel overdressed. Mayor, thank you for taking the time to be with us. This is an historic event, I keep saying, that students are getting to talk directly to people who may be the President of the United States about an issue that they have in many ways motivated, right? They've animated. For people of my generation, it is people of their generation who have made us understand how crucial this is, although one may understand it just by witnessing events around the world. But today, in particular, there are these climate strikes around the world where people are turning out in huge numbers. And that makes this a really important day to be having this conversation. So we're deeply appreciative that you're here and engaging with these students and the students at the various watch parties around the country. There are a lot of things that make you an interesting candidate. Anybody can pick one. You're crazy young. You've had military experience. You talk many languages. You have worked in corporate America. You're gay. But for the purposes of this discussion, there's one. For a minute, I thought maybe I got that wrong.
No, you're right.
Okay. For the purposes of this discussion, the one that actually strikes me as the most interesting about you is that you talk very openly about being a person of faith. And I want to understand how you connect that to this issue of climate change and our custodianship of the earth and our moral responsibilities, because we've got enough time to talk about the science and what you're going to do about it. But you often bring faith into the discussion of why we need to do the right thing. Does that apply to the climate?
I think it does, because I think climate is a moral issue. And this is about stewardship. It is about justice. Justice among people living on the earth right now, some of whom are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than others, but also justice between generations, right? If it matters how the choices you make in your life help or hurt another human being, then I think it matters into the future too, even if you don't see or share the same time with the people that you're helping or hurting. Look, my party has historically been a little bit allergic to talking about faith for what I actually consider to be a very good reason. And that is that we have seen the consequences of someone's faith being imposed on somebody else. And so we need to make sure that we honor the idea of standing for people of every religion and no religion equally. But I also think there's a moment here where we should invite those who are motivated by religious, moral considerations to know that those are some of the things that are at stake in what we're doing to this planet. I remember interacting with a senior Republican elected official who will remain nameless during one of the times that we were having terrible flooding in South Bend. And I was saying, look, we could really use some help, and I think we've reached the point where we know that this is the sort of thing that's going to increase. And she said, well, God is doing all kinds of things. You never know what's happening. And I said, yeah, okay, but we have increased frequency and severity of weather events that are harming us just as has been predicted. And she said something else about God. And I just kept thinking, what greater sin than to blame God for something people are doing that is harming other people?
Right.
This is a moral challenge, and it's up to us to do something about it.
Do you think that might resonate with some people? a small group of people who still deny the science, but for whom faith might be a door into this topic.
I think as long as we're transparent about our own beliefs and motivations, then we should open up every door we can find to get toward action on this issue. It's why, and I'm sure we'll touch this more during our conversation, but it's why I think we should work really hard to engage rural America. It's why we should work very hard to engage workers in industry and make sure they can picture a role in this transition besides that of victim. And yes, I think people who are in historically conservative areas, who are motivated by faith, but also for that very reason, have, I think, cause to care about the impact of the choices we're making. We should absolutely be engaging that kind of reasoning as well.
So you, again, yet another interesting thing about you is where you come from in the country, because it does seem that this is less of a divide amongst urban Americans and more of a divide amongst rural Americans. So talk to me about where you see selling what you, President Pete Buttigieg, would do to rural Americans.
Well, first of all, rural Americans need to know where they fit. And the great thing is there is tremendous potential for farming, for example, to be part of the solution here. So if you go to Iowa, there is a lot of pride in rural Iowa about Norman Borlaug, the person who helped develop new techniques for growing and seeds that arguably saved over 1 billion lives by helping to end famine with improved farming techniques around the world. And I think a lot about that example because in our time, we could take just as much pride if it was in America, on American farms, in American rural areas, that we pioneered some of the sustainable farming techniques, soil management that can actually take out as much carbon from the air as the global transportation sector is putting in. Cover crops and other means. The original carbon capture and sequestration technology is plants, right? So there's a lot that can be done in rural America that I think creates a sense of pride rather than only a sense of guilt when we talk about the relationship between agriculture and climate change, especially when you also consider the fact that it's folks in agriculture who are among those with the most to lose.
Right.
The amount of prevented planting that happened definitely in my part of the country just this year because of waterlogged fields from ridiculously unseasonable concentration of rain has led, I think, even those who have been conditioned to be slow to accept climate change to notice that at the very least there's an awful lot of bad weather. And the vulnerability that people have, and especially if you really spend time with farmers, you're talking to folks who in many ways do math for a living. If you're running a farm, you're trying to manage risk and know when to lock in a contract based on the ups or down prices, when you're going to sell what you're growing, when you think the optimal time to plant is, what's happening to the prices for fertilizer and seeds. You're managing risk.
And by the way, that's
for
Boston.
a living.
That's Boston.
Wow, that is powerful.
Is that Boston? I just want to confirm. That's Boston. These are the people here on this climate strike.
Good.
So that is, I think that is good. That's the thing that's going to make the difference in this world, that these people are going on. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were saying as an economics guy, that's really resonant.
Just to finish the thought. I mean, what farmers are dealing with now is increased uncertainty. And the more uncertainty, the more vulnerable they become. And we know that climate change is accelerating that. So we absolutely have a message to bring to people who maybe have not felt like they're part of this conversation. Look, everybody's got a plan on climate. I think the biggest thing that's going to make the difference is what can actually get done. Can we actually make it happen? And for a project as big as what this country is going to have to do in order to tackle this issue, we have to mobilize the entire country around it. And that means finding ways. It's not about watering down any of what we have to say. It's about making sure everybody sees where they fit. And that's absolutely true for rural America.
So because you're a mayor, and because you're not really an incrementalist about things, you think big. I think that might be why you're running for president. It's amazing. But your plan's actually smaller than a lot of your competitors in terms of the math, in terms of the money that you're allocating for it. Talk to me about that. It's many times smaller than some of your competitors.
Yeah, it depends whether you measure the ambition of a plan by how much money it is taxing and pumping through the U.S. Treasury in order to solve the problem. versus measuring it based on the outcomes. And maybe it's just my experience as a mayor, because a lot of times we've been in situations where people measured what we were doing by how much we were putting in terms of money. And I was much more focused on how much we were getting out in terms of results. I don't believe that we need to pump all of the resources going into dealing with these issues through the US government in order to make something happen. In fact, on the contrary, I think we need to make sure that the entire economy, including the private sector, especially the private sector, is designed in such a way that it's tending toward climate justice and climate action. It's why, for example, I'm just going to call it what it is. We need a climate tax. We need a carbon tax to make sure that the economic signals are rearranged.
Where does that go? Where does that tax go? It's charged to the people who bring oil out of the ground or take coal out of the ground?
Yeah, the further up the supply chain you do it, the better. But of course, it does flow through all the way to the counter. Now, one difference in the way I view it is, even though we're going to have to raise a lot of money to do some of the things I propose we do, I'm not going to do it through the carbon tax. I want to rebate out the carbon tax with a dividend that goes to the American people, based on a progressive formula. So the idea is most Americans will be made more than whole because the carbon tax is
because your gas price or your electricity price will go up as a result of a carbon tax, which will be a disincentive, and you're saying those people will get a rebate of sorts.
Exactly, because what we need to do is make sure that the prices shift in relative terms. We need to make sure that it becomes relatively more attractive to have an electric vehicle instead of a gas vehicle.
You want gas prices to go up and oil prices to go up.
You need it to reflect the true cost of carbon. But we don't, in order for all that to work, you don't have to suck the money out of the economy. You can give it back to Americans. You just need to make sure that those Americans, that all of us are in an economy where the prices accurately reflect.
So you're shifting the incentive. So if I want to drive a big truck, I can drive the big truck.
You're going to have to pay more
for the gas. Okay. And if I drive a vehicle and I'm paying more for gasoline, somehow your plan will figure out if I need the money.
Well, yeah, the idea would be a progressive formula geared toward
based on
income, so that most Americans are more than whole. Because this is not about taking money away from you. This is about rearranging the prices so that they are truer to the true cost of the things that we're doing.
All right, so that's one area of what we're looking at. You've talked about agriculture. What's the big way in which you see us getting off of fossil fuels? You've embraced the Green New Deal. How do you see us fully getting there? Is that going to be enough? Is taxing carbon going to be enough of a disincentive because gas prices will go up, oil prices will go up, coal prices will go up?
I think it's necessary but not sufficient. So my idea of a Green New Deal is one that layers all of these things together. I don't see how we do it without the carbon tax and dividend. I also think we need to invest much more in research. Look, if you just set it to the level of what we did for the Manhattan Project or the moon landing on an annual basis, we would be doing a lot more than we do now, which is in the neighborhood of $6 billion. I believe we need to quadruple that, more than $20 to $24 billion annually in R&D. And it should go mainly in three areas: renewable energy, we all talk a lot about that, energy storage, and because that makes the renewable energy more usable, and carbon storage. Now, with carbon storage, this is not about cooking up ways to store it so that we have an excuse to keep putting it out there in the first place. It's a recognition of the fact that we are going to have to do both. We're going to have to radically cut what's going into the atmosphere, and we're going to have to find ways to take some of what's in the atmosphere out.
So when you say radically think about this, how do we radically think about that science? And you've pledged $200 billion over 10 years to develop new technologies.
Right.
And again, because you're a guy who's spent time both in the military and the corporate sector, I want to understand how you think that gets spent. Is that government grants to universities? Is it things like the X Prize and incentivized competitions? How do you spend $200 billion to develop new technologies in the most efficient way?
It's a mix. So part of what I'm proposing is a clean tech fund that helps provide bridge capital and buy down the risk of a lot of actors who are innovating and creating promising climate technologies but have not been able to bring it to market or have trouble getting investors because there is a little bit of risk. We, I think, as a country, should take responsibility for buying down that risk. Part of it is making sure that we have a green energy bank for similar purposes, but the beauty of getting that right is we can also have a focus in concepts that are going to have an impact in disadvantaged communities. Then I also propose that we have a global investment fund. This is motivated by looking at what's going on with China. China is the biggest player in investments abroad with infrastructure right now, and it is not exactly green. When the U.S. is similarly deploying investments overseas, it meets a lot of our national security strategy objectives, earning friendship and cementing support and helping countries prosper. But we do it in a way that also supports an American clean technology industry and creates bigger markets for that, because a lot of these technologies, they exist now. They're just nowhere near the scale where they become affordable to pencil out. It's starting to happen with solar.
But we missed a big boat on solar because we didn't do what China does. We didn't throw the heft of the federal government behind research into solar. For better or for worse, China did.
Right. And as a country, we still hesitate to make big investments.
Right.
We have so much faith in the private sector. The private sector can do remarkable things. But the way I think of it is, the private sector is good at developing billion-dollar ideas. If you need $1 trillion idea, it usually has to come out of the academy or out of federal research. I mean, think about the difference between inventing the iPhone, which a company did, or inventing the internet, which the federal government did. We need to do some of that baseline, basic research that makes it possible for the next layers to happen in the private sector.
So NASA might be a better example, where it was government money and then it moved into the private sector by virtue of incentivized money that got a whole bunch of companies to say, all right, the government did a lot of the heavy lifting here, but we're not looking at doing the final mile on shipping things around space. Why don't we hand that over to the private sector? That might be a model, because we are looking at stuff that's at that scale, right? We talk about it as moonshot-like because...
If anything, that's an understatement for what we're trying to do. I mean, this will be one of the great national projects in American history.
But private enterprise and innovation here has had a hell of a headwind because they are up against a subsidized industry.
Exactly.
The fossil fuel industry gets billions of dollars from Americans. Little entrepreneurs don't get billions of dollars from Americans.
That's right. Well, we can change that. That's part of what I seek to do with the clean energy funding and the green bank I propose to set up. But we also have to do away with these incentives. Look, we are pumping taxpayer money. You don't always see it because a lot of times it's a tax expenditure instead of cash. We're pumping taxpayer money into keeping things the way they are. And then when you propose something like a good rail network, folks say, well, you can't do that because it won't pay for itself. You know, it doesn't pay for itself, driving, because we subsidize it in countless ways. And if there's anything that we've been reminded this week on the international front, it's just how vulnerable energy supplies are from a security standpoint when we're hooked up to the Middle East in the way that we are right now, too.
Do you really see a zero or a carbon neutral future by 2050 and a zero carbon future thereafter?
I believe we can get to net zero emissions by 2050. I believe we have to. Look, these timelines are being argued about as though we get to set them. The timelines are being set by science. The timelines are being set by reality. The only question is whether politics can catch up, and we've got to insist that it does. And what's so moving and so powerful about the students mobilizing today in these climate strikes is people with the moral urgency of having a very personal stake, moving these topics out of the hearing room and off of the textbook page and into the reality of demanding that their lives be made better by those in power.
What is your personal stake in this?
Well, I'm hoping to be here in 2050, and that means that, so, to me, this is not an abstract, my grandkids kind of thing. Obviously, I hope to have grandkids, and I hope they do great, but I think I'm going to be here, and...
It's going to be hot.
And it means I will be, for one thing, held accountable. I think my generation will be held accountable because it will be on our watch that this thing played out. I actually think this is one of those moments that... like many moments in American history, really pivotal ones, like maybe the American Revolution itself, the struggle for civil rights. It may be that of all the things we're doing right now, the thing we're going to be remembered for will boil down to where we were on this issue.
Yeah, Jay Inslee thinks so. Yeah. He thinks we can get the other stuff right? Healthcare is a policy issue. Equity is a policy issue. This is different. This isn't just a policy issue.
Right.
This is a, as you said, it might be a revolution.
Yeah. Well, and in my view, it's a global security issue.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. A number of students through the course of the last 2 days have brought up the issue of climate migrants, climate refugees, the idea that the world was almost set on its head by a couple million refugees from Syria. going to look a lot worse than that once the earth starts drying and people can't farm, or they can't, or it's flooding and they can't farm their land. How do we think about that?
Well, first of all, it's an example of how we can't just debate whether this is an issue. We got to get ready for it, because no matter how good of a job we do on preventing climate change from getting worse, this is happening now, and it is only going to increase. Look, a lot of refugee crises are overdetermined. There's lots of different layers, and so it can be easy to wave away some of the causes. Obviously, a big cause of the Syrian civil war is the brutality of the regime there. But there's also no question that it was made more difficult by the consequences of drought. If we're going to continue to be concerned about Central American migrants at our borders, let's think about ways in which life could be even harder than it is now in the Central American Triangle if we're not doing something. We're talking about the potential displacement of hundreds of millions of people, and a lot of this is not the kind of international conflict that leaps to mind. It's also internally in America. I mean, a lot of internal migration is going to go on that will upend the way our communities are set up. So we have to act in a way that both prevents this from getting worse and acknowledges that it's going to happen no matter what. And I believe we're going to need effectively a climate watch floor or a climate mission control as part of our national security operations to try to anticipate what is happening in the near future, from food insecurity to enhanced natural disasters, and how that might, on a short-term, 3, 6, 9-month horizon, lead to forced migration so that we can prepare aid and security to do something about that.
So you've mentioned a few places where climate comes into play. It's a transportation issue, it's a housing issue, it's a military issue, it's obviously it's an agriculture issue, it's an EPA issue, it's a Department of Energy issue. Most people probably didn't realize until 2 weeks ago that NOAA is part of the Department of Commerce. So it's a Department of Commerce issue, so that you can't change maps about where hurricanes are going to go. So given that it is all of those things, and you just said there should be some kind of climate mission control from a national security perspective, seems there needs to be a climate mission control for government. How does a Buttigieg administration deal with how to coordinate the activities of kind of every government department so that this is an all-of-government response rather than a sentiment or an opinion?
No question there needs to be White House level coordination, and we're probably going to have to reimagine how some of our agencies work, making sure that the climate related responsibilities, not just through the EPA, but agencies like NOAA, you're right, most people would be surprised to know that's in part of commerce. We have a whole other conversation about the org chart related to commerce, which I think is very interesting, because it's actually the closest thing America has to a Department of Data, and we probably need something more along those lines. But let me say this, I know there's some appeal to the idea of assigning a czar, know, who's going to be kind of the person on this. I think this is bigger than any issue that can be handled. I think the climate czar has to be the President of the United States, because this has to be a central issue for the whole administration.
And so when these students or those students in Boston or anybody is saying, this may be the most important issue, and I think for individuals in America, there are other things that are really important, but en masse, this is probably the biggest issue. Why Pete Buttigieg?
Well, first of all, it's personal. It's personal to me, again, as somebody who expects to be around to be held accountable in 2050 on whether we got on the right track in 2020. It's personal as somebody who lives in the American Midwest. And part of what we got to do is move the imagination around where climate change is happening off of the North and South Pole and into the whole country, including the middle of the country. Because I live in a river city and right by the river. And we've had 2 floods, 2 supposedly once in a millennium floods, 18 months apart. And so I view this through the very human lens of what happens to people. Not just what happens to glaciers, but what happens to people because of what we did. And I have the perspective of a mayor who has no time for this Washington environment where we wind up having the biggest debates about the smallest things. I'm not interested in plastic straws right now. I'm sorry, I'm just not. We have millions of lives on the line because of carbon. The problem is carbon. And if you're a mayor trying to fix a problem, then you know that you just figure out what it's going to take to get it done. And I see, once again, this drift toward competing over the technical elegance of our respective plans. And what worries me is that we'll continue to have this debate 10 or 20 years from now, until all that's left to debate is whose fault it was that we didn't get anything done. And last, but probably most importantly, I'm determined to unify the American people around this. My approach is that of gathering together all of the energies of the entire country, not clubbing anybody over the head, telling them, you are part of the problem because of where you live or what you do, but inviting them to be part of the solution so that they take pride in what we're doing about it. I believe we need to summon the energies of the entire country to do this. And we haven't even gotten into the global conversation. I'm sure that'll come up, but we need to be leading globally on this in order to get anywhere. And that can't happen without determined presidential leadership.
Will you invite the oil companies to be part of the solution?
Well,
or will you be mad at the oil companies for getting us into this?
First of all, we can't subsidize the oil companies to keep things the way they are. And companies are made of people. And we need to make sure that workers in an industry whose relevance is going to change, and some of whose practices just have to change, see where they fit in the future. We can do that. My plan will, on net, create 3 million new jobs. But I guess the best word I could use is recruit. I'm not sure we can recruit the oil company executives and lobbyists who are doing everything they can to keep things the way they are. But we can absolutely recruit workers in that industry.
So what does that look like? You may not be an oil worker. You may be a worker that works for ExxonMobil, or you may be from West Texas, and you may run a pizza joint that caters to people who work in the oil fields. What does that look like? When I work, if I'm that person, how do I say this guy's not going to steal my livelihood and prosperity?
Right. The message is we need your help. We've got to do this. There's no alternative, but we need your help. So I'm thinking about folks in St. Joe County, Indiana, union workers, who went pretty quickly, in one case, from working on internal combustion vehicles to working on electric vehicles. And we need more and more of that so people see how they fit. And look, there's going to be some tough transitions. It's why I'm also proposing that we invest in health and retirement buyouts for people that we can't find a new role right away. But this is about ensuring that everybody is in on the solution, because it's just too big for people to be divided around it. By the way, we'll know we're getting somewhere when Republicans find it necessary to create a plan as well. I don't think it'll be as good, but we are way past the point when we should be debating whether to deal with the problem. The only debate that I think is relevant is how to deal with the problem. There should be, in a healthy two-party system right now, we'd be arguing over whether the conservative Republican approach for getting us carbon neutral by 2050 was better than the progressive Democratic approach. But they're just not even there, and we can't wait for that.
And does anybody here have discussions with people about whether climate is real? Does that still happen? Put up your hands if you've had that.
Still happens.
Wow. Okay. There's work to be done. You talked about a green bank. What is that about?
Well, basically, we got to finance the technologies that are being created and the deployment of those technologies in areas that might be overlooked otherwise. There is a risk gap, right, on newer technologies, and I think the American people have a stake in ensuring that more risks are taken to accelerate the innovation past what would happen otherwise. And so that does mean we need to have a commitment to co-invest in a lot of these enterprises and have a little bit of political courage to know that not all of them will work out.
So does that work like an infrastructure bank where the government is a sort of an anchor investor but it attracts private investment, or is this guaranteeing loans, or is this making loans?
I think loan guarantees will be the main way that we can make a difference. But we could also capitalize intermediate institutions. Think about, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but think about how, for
these
example,
guys like weeds.
All right. So think about CDFIs, community development financial institutions, right? They're capitalized often by bigger financial institutions. And then they go, and because they understand what's happening at a community level, can make investments in areas and causes that are underserved, social enterprises, underserved neighborhoods, MBEs. And I think that the model could track that in a way. The important thing is to make sure we're pushing capital into this very, very needed field where they're still not getting enough.
Right. So you're still thinking, and I mean this in a good way, but as a business person, that this capital can be deployed to get a better return. If it's taxpayer capital, it's used for developing businesses that will solve this problem.
And I think that's a good investment, because what we know is the market left on its own is
Right.
too short term to reflect the returns we get from saving trillions of dollars in the long run,
Right.
from not blowing it on the climate. But that just doesn't show up in business models today that rarely look more than 7 years into the future.
So let's talk about being the mayor of a city and having experience with floods, 100-year floods, 500-year floods, 1,000-year floods, and think, how do you think about how we have settled this nation, how we have settled into floodplains and coastal areas, and how we have poured concrete into places that used to be drainage basins, and whether or not we should be thinking about that for the future?
We definitely have to plan for the future with a different level of priority on resilience. We have got to prepare for the reality that a 500-year flood is not a 500-year flood anymore. I mean, one area where we really are literally taking out the Sharpie and kind of moving the lines is not to distort reality, but to reflect reality. Because it turns out that what used to show up on a map as a 1,000-year floodplain is now going to get flooded multiple times within our lives. So you look at a place like Cedar Rapids, where they had horrible floods.
Yep.
Came together as a community, found ways to do a lot of relocation without forcing it on people before they were ready, and while supporting people, because again, often those who are in the most climate vulnerable areas are the most economically vulnerable too. The disproportionate impact on communities of color is shocking if you map out what's going to happen as these climate impacts worsen.
Well, because that would make sense, right? That people who are able to afford what they can afford end up in places that might flood.
Often,
more likely to flood more often.
So, look, we need to update the maps. We need to make sure we're providing resources for people who never thought they needed flood insurance and now are going to. I think there's some other things under the hood we can do around catastrophic insurance more generally as a country that get the risk kind of better managed. But we've got to face the fact that a lot of areas need to be designed with a different future. We're doing it in South Bend. I just the other day was touring a park that we're redoing, and we had this problem with flooding into a very important park in the heart of our downtown. It's where the city meets the river, and we realized we can't fight the water anymore.
Right.
So we just, now where there used to be a field, there's a pond. It's going to catch the water, and if that sidewalk gets flooded, it's okay because we've designed around it now. The whole country needs to do that in a number of different ways.
The mitigation of these things beforehand is a lot cheaper than insurance.
Always.
On the other side. But our federal infrastructure for dealing with disaster doesn't always recognize that. In other words, it may not be ideal that we're looking for FEMA to mitigate bad planning.
Well, we've got to streamline what's going on with disaster recovery on the back end, too. We got folks being flooded right now in Houston.
Correct.
Who are still waiting on checks from Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah.
And there's an alphabet soup. We saw it again in South Bend. It was nothing like what's happening in Houston, but when we had those floods, people didn't know whether it was FEMA, SBA, something that passed through locally, where they were supposed to go. And the last thing you need when you're put out of your home by an emergency is more bureaucracy. So I'm going to set up a disaster preparedness commission, give them 100 days to report back on how to streamline some of these processes, because it's clearly become way too bureaucratic. And they're dipping into it for funding, right? They're dipping into FEMA to fund other things. We got to protect the funding. There's going to be more, not less, demand for this
FEMA
kind of
doesn't
work.
need less money.
Exactly.
Let's go up to the balcony for the first question.
Hi, Mayor Pete. My name is William Neely, and I'm a master's student here at Georgetown studying foreign service. My question for you is, how do you intend to motivate those Americans who don't believe in climate change or don't see climate change as a legitimate threat to U.S. interests?
Right. So I think that there's a psychology to this that we've got to acknowledge. I don't think "see, I told you so" is always the best way to win somebody over. And so really what we got to do is help people, as I was saying earlier, picture how we're recruiting them to be part of the solution. And I want to appeal to a sense of pride. One thing I've proposed is a national service plan. We create 1 million paid national service voluntary opportunities across the country. And a big part of that would be a climate core. And it's for working on projects from weatherizing homes to improving community resilience. And the reason is I think we need all of us to feel like we're in on the solution, so that the primary emotion you feel when climate comes up is something other than defensiveness or guilt, which just doesn't bring out the best, at least in most of us. Now, we also got to recognize that this can't wait till we convince 100% of the American people that we've got to do something. We've got to just get in motion and then invite people to be part of it. Because frankly, if you're still debating whether this is real, The debate has moved on. It has passed you by.
This guy's making me look bad. Standing up, no jacket, and I think we're just gonna.
Look at that.
Let's just get real here. All right. Let's look at the monitors for a student from the University of Southern California. Go ahead. From the University of Southern California. Go ahead.
Hey Mayor Pete, I'm Rohit, I'm a senior majoring in cinema studies, and many students here, including me, woke up at 5 a.m. this morning.
Yep.
We came to campus in the dark because climate change is a really important issue to us. And I look up to you to really lead us and this nation through this crisis. So my question is, some sources and students call your climate plan more modest in terms of federal spending compared to your competitors. Since many young voters prioritize climate change as the threat to society, why should we support your plan that spends less towards climate action initiatives when other candidates are ready to invest much more in their programs?
Great question, and thank you for your passion on this. Look, my plan is the most ambitious, one of the most ambitious things our country has done, not just on climate, but period, in the history of the Republic. I just don't measure our ambition by how many federal dollars we bring into the Treasury and pump back out to do something about it. I believe that the greater part of the solution lies in ensuring, incentivizing, and often requiring and demanding that the private sector and the economy as a whole be geared toward climate solutions. This cannot just be a government project. It also can't happen without leadership from the government. And that's what my plan achieves. It will deliver a carbon neutral economy by 2050. That is the result. And the question is, how do we reach that result? I think most of my competitors aim for that result. The question is, what's going to actually get us there? And it's the same on healthcare and some other issues where I'm putting forward plans that are more ambitious than anything that's happened in my lifetime. I just don't think we measure it by how much we have to tax and spend in order to get it done.
So is that
by the way, this is more than $1 trillion. It's not a small thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's a more responsible way to get it done.
But is that a failure in the way we think about how we measure things? Because if you are going down this road in a few examples where you're not pledging the same amount of money, but you're saying that you're going to have as good a result,
right.
Do we have to shift the way we think about that? And how are you going to succeed in that? Because you're going to get questions like this where people say, hey, I'm looking at all the money they're spending. His is the smallest.
Well, I think we got to focus on outcomes instead of inputs. And I've seen this as a mayor, I've seen this again and again. Look, part of what's happening is folks are sizing up the plans.
Right.
And they're trying to find a way to compare page after page of my white paper versus their white paper. And so they want to find something that's super easy to compare, so they're looking for a number. And one easy number is how much money are you going to spend. I just don't think that's the important number. Now again, I don't want to minimize how much we're going to have to invest in this, because this is over $1 trillion. But I also think that the real measure of this is, does it meet the targets that we need to hit for the good of the climate? Right. And can it actually get done? Because I think we're still talking a little bit too easily about in the kind of Washington frame, rather than talking about what's going to take to actually deliver some kind of action.
Go ahead.
Hi, Mayor Pete. My name is Megan McKenna. I'm from New York, and I'm a senior here at Georgetown studying government and American studies. Many of the changes that are needed to combat climate change and reduce carbon emissions will displace the workers of industries that are detrimental to our climate, like coal and natural gas. Supporting workers and families through such disruptions can't have answers as simple as just retraining coal miners to install solar panels. You've talked a lot about being a mayor of a community that continues to face challenges of disruptive transitions in the American economy. As president, how will you address the potentially drastic effects that important climate change initiatives will have on workers and families, particularly on those who are already economically disadvantaged?
Great. So you're right. It's not just about retraining. And what a lot of well-intentioned retraining programs miss, what I've learned being from the industrial Midwest, is that there's a lot more to a job than a paycheck. The paycheck's important, and if a paycheck gets disrupted, we got to have an answer on that. And we do. But in many ways, that's the easier part compared to responding to identity. Somebody's work is their identity. We still, when you're at dinner somewhere, getting to know somebody for the first time, when they want to ask the question, who are you? The way they ask the question is they say, what do you do? And if we tell somebody who has worked for 2/3 of their career as a machinist that now they're supposed to be something completely different, we have taken away somebody's identity. So, first of all, we have to recognize, and this is where I think the green jobs conversation gets a little lost, that not all of the new jobs we're creating are exotic. We need machinists working on electric vehicles just like we need as part of the regular internal combustion related car industry. A lot of the jobs that we're going to create if we do the retrofits that we've got to do on just buildings to make them more energy efficient are traditional and often union construction jobs. We're talking about building trades, insulators, plumbers, and pipe fitters, and electrical workers. These are good paying, skilled construction jobs that we need to be generating more of anyway because they're a great pathway into the middle class. Having said all that, we also do need to do the basic groundwork of ensuring that we have answers on when we have to buy somebody's retirement out, or whether we have to make sure that we bridge their ability to get health and other benefits, or create ways to benefit whole communities that may be disproportionately impacted by some of these shifts away from a fossil fuel economy. And my plan proposes that we invest richly in that because it is so important. If we're doing those things all together, and I keep coming back to this, recruiting people to be part of the solution in a way they can be proud of, that, I think, over and above any of the stuff we do around training and paychecks, is how we really make it happen. There's a story about President Kennedy touring one of the facilities belonging to NASA, and noticed a janitor mopping the floor, putting together a certain corridor in that space center. And he asked that janitor, what do you do here? And the response was, I'm helping put somebody on the moon. And we need to make sure that everybody in every different part of our economy understands that we need them to be part of this, because this is bigger in many ways than anything we've done. And if we want to lead the world in this, we got to inspire the world in this. And that means an American people that is motivated to be part of this. This is too big, too important, too urgent, and too serious to be an issue that people remain divided around.
Let's go up to the balcony.
Mayor Pete, my name is Mahek Ahmad. I'm a sophomore in the college, majoring in government and minoring in Arabic and women and gender studies. Right. And my question for you is, studies have shown that corporations, not countries, are overwhelmingly responsible for the shift in climate patterns over the past few decades. How do you plan to hold these corporations, particularly ones that transcend national borders, accountable for their impact on the environment?
Great. So, first of all, stop subsidizing them to continue putting carbon into the atmosphere. Secondly, that's part of what we can get at with things like a carbon tax and dividend, because it changes the economic signals. But as you said, a lot of these corporations straddle national boundaries. Now, I still think it's probably wrong to give governments a pass, because governments regulate those corporations and decide what they're going to allow in terms of the left and right boundaries. But often you have a multinational corporation that can take advantage of that fact in order to escape any individual country's accountability. That's why there's got to be such a thing as global climate diplomacy. And we see some evidence of it, like at the G7, where the leaders of some of the biggest economies in the world sat down to deal with the biggest issue on their mind, which had to do with climate. The problem is, the American seat at the table was empty. America can't do this alone. I also believe that the world can't do this with American leadership. We're just too big a piece of the puzzle. But for America to lead on climate, we have to actually be doing the right thing at home. And so I think a lot of this starts with the commitments that we are making domestically that authenticate the leadership we're going to have to take internationally to ensure that there are internationally respected norms on climate that corporate actors, even if they are global, have to work within.
Do you think there's a role in punishing companies that lied to us to do this, where they had evidence that they were doing bad things, in the same way that we think of tobacco? Sure. And we think of other, is there a federal government role, or is that lawsuits? What does that look like to you?
I think tobacco is becoming a better and better metaphor for what's going on here. Basically, there's bad news, they know it, and they cultivate doubt in order to delay the inevitable. And while that delay goes on, people suffer. And so I do think we need to develop an understanding of liability that, as we would in any other kind of harm, holds bad actors accountable for malfeasance, deception, and harm.
Right here.
Oh, hello, Mayor Pete. My name's Sam. I'm a freshman studying in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm from Massachusetts. And I am afraid I'm going to take the conversation back to the polls and ask a question. The Arctic is home to some 4 million people, many of whom belong to indigenous communities. And among those are some of the most vulnerable to climate change. Now, how would you as president shape the United States' role in the Arctic with respect to projects aimed at exploiting its natural resources and strategic value in light of climate change and these indigenous communities?
Great question, and you're right, it's not being talked about very much. But it's one more example of why the conversation has to be about people more than anything. This is not just about saving a planet. After all, the planet in some form is going to be here no matter what. The question is its ability to sustain life. And indigenous peoples, especially in the Arctic, are incredibly vulnerable to the changes that are taking place. One thing that I would do is reestablish active U.S. leadership in the Arctic Council. The nations of the Arctic have forums for coming together and dealing with these issues, but I don't think this administration has really shown the leadership that's needed to ensure that the voiceless are heard. And when you have, on the one hand, nations like the Scandinavian nations playing a big leadership role, and on the other hand, a country like Russia that is much more interested in economic and security implications than they are in the well-being of those people, it's really going to matter how America comes in as a broker to make sure that there are good outcomes. We have to ensure that the voices of, first of all, U.S. citizens who are indigenous peoples in Alaska are heard and not trampled with things like some of the continued exploration that's going on and being proposed for federal lands in the Arctic, and making sure that we create those forums where people from those in northern Scandinavia to those in Greenland are able to feel that they've been heard. And make sure that future treaty obligations take that into account, because they also have not always been tethered into what their own capitals are doing, even less so in some countries than in the United States.
Let's go over here, Mayor, for a question from Iowa State.
Hey there, Mayor Pete. My name's Luke Miller. I'm a junior studying mechanical engineering here at Iowa State, and my question is, how would you work with farmers in Iowa and adjacent states with how they will reduce their impact on dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico?
So one thing we've got to do is make sure that the federal government is supporting farmers in doing the right thing. After all, we found billions of dollars to pay farmers to not sell their goods to China. But we could have a lot more funding for things like the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. These exist as part of the Department of Agriculture. We should be investing in them. It's one thing to tell farmers we think they should do something different when it doesn't pencil out and their choice is to either continue doing things in a certain way or go out of business. It's another to make sure that with as much intention and as many resources as went into making sure that, taking care of the oil and gas companies, for example, we're ensuring that farmers are not just encouraged or required, but incentivized and supported in using different materials, for example, right? Which is part of what's leading to the problem of the Gulf. It has a lot to do with fertilizers and chemicals. The farmers are already getting squeezed, on one end by suppliers, and on the other end by having a lot of consolidation in where they sell their goods. It's not that they don't want to. You sit down with farmers in Iowa, as we have, and they are as connected to the earth as any class of people in the United States. But we've got to show and sometimes create a way. And I think that's a very good use of federal dollars. It's the kind of thing that the Department of Agriculture is for.
It is institutional, though. I mean, part of the problem is it's so structural that farmers buy their seeds from a place, they buy their fertilizer. There have been examples where farmers who choose not to do that, independent farmers who are not industrial scale farmers, who choose not to do things a certain way get shut out by the consortiums. It is a similar lock to what the fossil fuel industry has on people. The big agricultural producers have on farmers.
Well, and it's why we've got to have more vigorous antitrust enforcement, because a lot of this is clearly consolidation leading to monopolies and monopsonies.
Right, it takes people's choices away to be able to buy the feed they want, or the fertilizer they want, or the crops they want.
Right, and then the farmers are caught in the middle.
Let's go over here.
Hi, Mayor. Thanks for taking my question. My name is Grace. I'm a sophomore student at the University of Maryland, College Park, studying public policy and Spanish. And my question for you is, given the recent reversal of California's exemption from federal law on car emission standards, do you believe that stricter federal standards are needed, or that individual states like California should be able to set their own standards as need be?
Remember when Republicans were big on states' rights and local control? Except when states try to do something progressive. And now they're getting preempted. It's wrong. And what California did was lead the way because Washington wouldn't. We should be embracing that. And I believe on something as pressing as emissions and climate, what we have nationally should be a floor when a state like California is ready to step up and show leadership. Now, that being said, they shouldn't have had to. I mean, the whole country should be leading the way with high standards. What was really interesting was to see how auto companies responded to those standards. When you create those requirements, they will work within those requirements and do what they do best: innovate, create, and improve. What we have now is, by the way, not only going to make things worse from a climate perspective, we're talking about more pollutants in the air that are going to harm people. And it's one more example of how this isn't just about the planet, this is about human beings who will suffer at higher rates because this administration is taking care of special interests and not taking care of the people who have the most to lose.
It's not even the special interest you'd think. The auto companies are on board with this. They were happy to make cars with higher.
It's almost like more pollution is, in principle, something they like.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're right. If even the car companies have figured out how to rally and move forward, and they're not even asking for this, it really is something for the administration to come in and decide to take America back.
So here's a good example, though, and I'm hard-pressed to figure out who wants that outcome, but there are people who opposed California's higher standards because de facto that created that standard around the country, right? Everybody, their car's made in Indiana, but they're made to that standard in California because California is so big and powerful. And there are people who said the car cost more because of those higher standards. So whether or not you agree with that, conceptually that's what's going to happen over the next 30 years, right? We're going to make some things cost more, and your proposal is that there's a dividend that goes back to people to offset the higher cost. But some things will cost more as we move to a less carbon-dependent society.
And the beauty of the carbon dividend is that people are made whole or better through that process. But that's the short term. The long term is we're going to be paying a horrific cost one way or the other. The question is, do we want to invest some now, or do we want to pay a lot later?
But we don't have that measure of a lot. Right?
Well, that's what the carbon tax does, right? It makes sure that the cost, the real cost of carbon, is being priced into the system. But yeah, this is why this is becoming a generational moment. Because the longer you're planning to be here, the more that cost is coming down on you. And so you have people taking to the streets right now talking about their own interests, because these aren't just abstract costs, these are literal dollars and cents costs, and they're going to crush people if we don't do something up front about it.
Very good. Right over here.
Hey, Mayor Pete. My name's Jake Menz. I'm from New York. I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown studying government and philosophy.
Great.
My question for you is basically the book of Genesis dictates specifically that humankind has dominion over the earth, and that's often interpreted as complete control over all of nature. You're a man of faith yourself. How would you speak to Americans, particularly Judeo-Christian Americans, who prioritize their faith? And who say that nature is ours to use as we like? How can you energize religious Americans, which is a big swath of our country, to help join the fight to support our planet?
Yeah. So the way I think of it is that every choice we make has some kind of moral weight. If, in a very real sense, it's clear that we have a certain kind of dominion over the earth because we're the only species that has the power to change it on purpose. The question is, how do we use that power? Do we use it for the benefit of our short-term appetites and interests? or do we use it for the benefit of other people and for all of creation? With that kind of power that we have comes a level of responsibility, as all power comes with responsibility. And the responsibility we have is to make sure that our choices make life better and not worse for those who are sharing this planet with us right now, those who are going to come in the future, and for creation in general. This is something that I believe we must bear as one of the most important responsibilities entrusted to us, precisely because we do have so much power. We are changing the face of this planet. It is completely up to us. And the one thing that has transitioned over time, I think, for how most people of faith view our relationship to the climate and the environment is that we used to rely much more on mystical explanations or beliefs in divine intervention to understand why certain calamities were coming our way. Now, through the gift of science, we have a better and better understanding of how things come to pass, and with that, the awareness of our responsibility. So the other thing that happens in that early part of the Bible is the awareness of good and evil, right? And once you know, you have a different kind of relationship to the choices that are going to be made. I think we ought to think about that when we're thinking about what responsibilities our relationship to creation imposes upon us.
So this is interesting, not to get crazy theological here, but you're not taking issue with that interpretation that humans have dominion over the earth. You're saying because humans have dominion over the earth, you should do the right thing.
I mean, I tend to think of it as stewardship rather than dominance, but in a very real sense, that idea of dominion has played out in a way we can observe whether you're whether you belong to that faith tradition or not, right? In just a very obvious manner, we do indeed have that dominion. So the question is, what are we going to do with it?
Right. Right there.
Hello, I'm Athena Palmer. I'm a freshman at UDC. Environmental racism is a huge issue in America right now, with communities of color being completely disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. In 2018, the EPA confirmed that across the country, non-white communities were burdened disproportionately with the effects of pollution. What steps will you take to ensure that all communities, regardless of race or socioeconomic standing, will be helped by your environmental policies?
Thank you. This is one of the many ways in which this proves to be a moral question. And environmental justice is the lens that I think a lot of these decisions need to be taken through. It's one of the reasons why the fund that I'm proposing that we set up, $250 billion, to help incentivize, propel, and support new developments, will be geared toward disadvantaged communities. This is also part of a much bigger question, though, about institutional racism in this country. It's why I've proposed a Douglas plan, as ambitious as the Marshall Plan, to dismantle systemic racism, because it has a way of causing every problem to be worse for people of color. And so this is a stark example, but unfortunately not the only example of how inequity filters through to every social issue that we're dealing with. I think we need to put concrete, real, specific, and countable resources into mitigating that. And it's why supporting resilience is so important, because we need to make sure that communities have the tools that they need, and often it's at the local level that there's the most knowledge about how to ensure people aren't harmed by this. But I've seen this in South Bend when we had the flash floods. Some folks, it's not a big deal to clear out, get a sump pump in your basement, and go stay in a hotel for a few days. And for others, it is a crushing disruption in their lives. And we cannot be blind to the cost that will impose on the already backsliding progress that we have as a country toward racial equity in our time.
You know, when you see it from the perspective of a hurricane or a flood or a wildfire, you can see the immediate effect, and it's not an abstraction. But the problem is kids who are getting asthma, people who are getting illnesses or cancers because of climate change. That becomes harder to measure, particularly in hard-hit communities, because of our inability for them to access health care properly.
That's right.
So it's not clear that somebody's kid has asthma that might be related to pollution, because that somebody may not be seeing a doctor.
That's how all these things are connected. You can't touch that issue without looking at the health implications. We also can't understand what's happening in health without understanding what's happening in housing. Right now in South Bend, we have a terrible lead poisoning problem, and it has nothing to do with the water. The water is great. It's the houses. And there are not enough resources to remediate the houses or help families live in houses that are safe for them. And we see these patterns of injustice interwoven. It's why we're going to have to tackle the entire thing at once.
One last quick question.
Hi, my name is Sarah Villanueva. I am from the suburbs of Chicago. I'm a sophomore in the School of Nursing and Health Studies at Georgetown, studying healthcare management and policy, and this is my question. In 2017, Hurricane Irma and Maria caused catastrophic destruction in Puerto Rico and consequently had devastating effects on millions of people on the island, including my family and friends. Federal aid was criticized for being inefficient, unorganized, and lacking, and to this day, parts of the island have not fully recovered. As natural disasters continue to be more prominent, how will you, as President of the United States, focus and navigate the relationship between the federal government and Puerto Rico to ensure that proper aid is provided in quick and effective manner?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear that you were personally impacted by the storm and the response. And the first thing I would say is that if Puerto Rico had votes in the Electoral College, I don't think this would have happened. One of the things we're seeing with students taking to the streets, I think, is that younger Americans are less patient, less likely to accept fundamentally unacceptable realities. Something happens the longer you're around that you start just getting used to things that are completely indefensible. And that's what's happening on climate. That's certainly the case with the fact that DC is not a state. And just for the record, I say that in Iowa, not just in DC. The statehood question obviously is a little more complex in Puerto Rico, but I believe that if that's the choice of the people of Puerto Rico, it should be accepted. And I also believe we shouldn't wait on that in order to at least have representation in the Electoral College. Because as much as we've talked about this in terms of science, in terms of economics, in terms of faith, in many ways this is a question about power and the political empowerment of those who have the most to lose is the best way we can see to it that something get done. So I can walk you through all the things I believe we should do to make FEMA more responsive and to ensure that something like that never happens again. But before we even get to the policy things that need to be changed to streamline and accelerate and better fund disaster aid and recovery, we've got to just look at who's at the table. And the best hope we have for dealing with climate and a whole lot of other issues is the moral urgency of young people demanding of the generation that's in charge that a better job be done to protect your future.
And that's where we're going to end with Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Back in 15 minutes with Tom Steyer. Thank you, young man. Appreciate it.